Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very glad to have you all here with us today. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure that you're chatting to everyone. We love to know who is with us in the room. The chat box is also where you can add your questions, and I'll try to bring them into the program as we're having our conversation. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive that works to transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture and who makes history by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in this work. The book talks are just one piece of what we do. So I hope you'll check out jwa.org to explore the full range of programs and resources that we offer. A quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, there should be a button that can turn them on. It is now, I think, under the More and Three Dots section, but there should be something that says Show Captions with a little button that says CC. Okay, I am delighted to welcome back to JWA this evening's author. Samira K. Mehta is an associate professor of women and gender studies and Jewish studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she currently serves as the director of Jewish studies. Her research and teaching focus on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States. Her first book, Beyond Chrismukkah, The Jewish Christian Interfaith Family in the U.S., was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. She has also published a book of personal essays called The Racism of People Who Love You, and that appeared on Oprah's Books We Can't Wait to Read in 2023, but more importantly, on JWA's podcast. She is also beginning a project for Princeton University Press called A Mixed Multitude, Jews of Color in the United States. And she's the primary investigator for a Henry Luce Foundation funded project called Jews of Color, Histories and Futures. Samira serves as a series editor for the North American Religion series at NYU Press. And today we are going to be discussing her new book, God Bless the Pill, The Surprising History of Contraception and Sexuality in American Religion, which you can see has that beautiful cover. Welcome, Samira. So glad to have you back with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Judith. I really appreciate you and the rest of JWA. And I will absolutely shamelessly say to everyone here, it's a fantastic archive. I send my students to explore it all of the time.
Yay, I love that. Um, so you begin the book with a preface that talks about your own lifelong interest in feminism and reproductive and the reasons that you took on this project and what you found. And I think you're going to begin by sharing a little bit of that with us.
Yes, so I'm going to, just in the name of not reading forever and ever, read the first paragraph, and then I'm going to read the last bit that is about the project. But I want to sort of say, having written it down, it is fair game to ask me to fill in some of the blanks if anyone is curious. I cannot remember a time when I was not interested in feminism. One of my parents' closest friends, a woman named Debbie Jacobs, worked for the Ms. Foundation and brought me a copy of Free to Be You and Me when I was about 3. I would sing along about how mommies could be almost anything they wanted to be, or how it was all right for boys to cry. I recall my mother objected to the poem about how everyone hated housework. While I suspect that my mother does hate it, as do I, my mother pointed out that for some of the women in the neighborhood, housework was a source of pride and accomplishment. From the very start, then, I grew up not only as a feminist, but as one who understood that there were many points of view within feminism. In grad school, however, my activism dropped off. I still marched when called for, still occasionally took a friend or a classmate for a rape kit, a pregnancy test, or an abortion. My activism dropped off because I was busy, but also because I felt like we had won. Not against sexual violence, but at least against anti-abortion activism, which by extension blocks women from birth control, pap smears, prenatal care, and anything else that women's health clinics provide. When I moved to Boston in 2000, the local Planned Parenthood said that it did not need volunteers. When I moved to Atlanta, I saw that there were protesters outside the women's health clinic around the corner from my synagogue's offices, but the protests looked so small, so ineffectual, that it felt like we had turned a corner. I did not foresee a day when my goddaughter would have less bodily autonomy than I had. When I started researching the role of religion in US birth control debates 10 years ago, I did not think that this would be a controversial topic. Indeed, I chose birth control over abortion because I was looking for something less controversial. I also thought that because birth control was less polarizing, this would be an interesting history to trace, a place where I could easily see how mainstream feminism had changed and shaped mainstream religion. I was excited to see how previous generations of feminists had created that change, and also, if I'm being honest, to see how my own work might be part of that lineage. This is a very different moment, and I have found a very different story from the one that I imagined. While this book will show that there was a great deal of feminist activism through the middle and end of the 20th century, it will also show that that activism was much less determinative than the influence of more conservative forces within religious groups and broader society. Women's growing access to birth control did not occur because religious authorities and political figures embraced bodily autonomy, sexual pleasure, and intellectual ambitions. Instead, religious advocacy for birth control grew from a focus on the economic and emotional health of the heteropatriarchal family. Even women's health was framed as important less because of a woman's right to health as an autonomous individual, and more because children were better off with a healthy mother, and certainly better off if their mother did not die in childbirth. Religious advocacy for birth control was limited. If one's goal was the feminist liberation of women and others with the capacity for pregnancy, it was also fragile. The expansion of birth control access was dependent on people using birth control in ways that the more conservative elements of society saw as enhancing rather than detracting from the family. As I share this book today, having written it for the most feminist of reasons, I must acknowledge that while such commitments can dictate the questions we ask, they cannot dictate the answers we find. For me, this reality is one of the hardest in practicing history. Judith, you're muted.
You would think all these years and I wouldn't realize that always mute when someone's reading so that the noises of my family don't intrude. But um, I always really appreciate it when a scholar pulls back the curtain a little bit and lets us into the process, which is that we can start a project with a particular idea of what we're going to find, but of course, it takes years and years of research to actually uncover the story. And sometimes you find yourself on a path that is a totally different argument than the one you thought you were making. And I think that that plus finding yourself on a historical path that was perhaps, as you say, not where you could have imagined 10 years ago makes for a really interesting project. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of what you expected or hoped to find and what you actually found in this narrative that you were exploring?
So, one of the first books that I read so I read, there are two books that I read when I embarked on this project that I thought were just fabulous. And I continue to think that they are just fabulous. And they are Melissa Clapper's Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, is about Jewish women's activism, feminist activism in reproductive health, in suffrage, and in anti-war movements. And it is a book that runs up until it's basically the first quarter to maybe third of the 20th century. And she writes about Jewish activism in favor of birth control in particular. I mean, also suffrage and anti-war activism, but in this case, in terms of reproductive health, she's really writing about sort of pregnancy, prenatal care, and birth control. And, these people, they were absolutely kick-ass in so many ways. They were awesome activists. They were in the way of early 20th century birth control activists, also had some eugenic politics that would change radically for them with the advent of the Third Reich.
And we'll
But
get into that, don't worry.
I, oh, good. I figured we would. Um, but they were inspiring, and her history is really inspiring. And they did a lot of important work, a lot of clinics, a lot of statements, good and important work. And then I also read America and the Pill, A History of Promise, Peril, and Liberation by Elaine Tyler May. And so it's important to say, I've only met Elaine Tyler May once in my life, but she wrote a different book that is the book that is why I am a feminist historian today. It's a book called Homeward Bound, and it's about the politics of the family in the Cold War.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And
I read that in grad school also.
yeah, and here I am, right? And here you are. It's a phenomenal book. Um, but she isn't
As
someone
is
who I,
Melissa's, I want to also say. Melissa
oh,
is a
yes,
great friend to
Melissa's book.
JWA too. Yeah.
Melissa's book is absolutely one of my primary conversation partners, I think, right? This is Quincy, everyone. I apologize. Um, but so anyway, I realized in reading America and the Pill that Elaine Tyler May doesn't really write very much about religion. Religion appears in a couple of places in terms of sort of its more conservative Christian forms, evangelical Christianity and the Catholic Church. And I read that, and I was thinking about Melissa Clapper's book, and I was thinking, okay, how would this look? So first of all, how would this look if we thought about Jewish religion? But also, I know a lot about and spent a lot of time in school with liberal Protestants. What would this look like if we were thinking about not conservative Protestants, but liberal Protestants? And I was expecting to see really important feminist activist work, in part because this is the very same chunk of time historically when when the Protestant denominations and in particular Reform, but eventually also conservative Judaism will start ordaining women. And so I thought the presence of women in like clergy leadership spaces would result in feminist conversations about birth control. And I also thought that perhaps women were being ordained in part because of some feminist activism in those traditions. And I thought I would see that kind of dovetailing. And instead, what I saw was a conversation among men in these religious spaces. The conversations look a lot like every now and then the administration will release a photo of someone signing some sort of bill that has to do with women's issues, and you'll look and you'll be like, wow, those are all white men. That was kind of what these conversations looked like. And they were conversations that presumed that birth control was good, but presumed that birth control was good because they were interested in questions about economic stability. They were concerned in an as divorce laws were getting more flexible, they wanted marriages to stay together. And they thought that birth control would be great for marriages staying together because you could have a sort of sexually dynamic marriage without the economic strain of more mouths than you could feed. And they were also really concerned about two kind of geopolitical phenomenon. One of them was the Cold War. In order to be sort of a good capitalist consumption-driven society, in order to have two Studebakers and a new KitchenAid mixer and to be able to update your washing machine. I don't know how often you're supposed to update your washing machine. Eventually, in my experience, they die. But right, like with the newest model, as innovations are happening, you need to not have lots of kids. You need to have scale your family so that you can have a disposable income, especially if you're doing it on one income. Um, and they were worried about overpopulation, which I hope we will also get a chance to
For
think
sure.
about.
Yeah.
overpopulation was, there are plenty of critiques. The Catholic Church was critiquing this sort of thought process at the time, but it was kind of accepted scientific and social scientific wisdom that the global population was going to expand faster than the food supply. And so there were worries that the kind of famine and panic that would be caused by that growing population would cause revolution, and the revolution would be communist revolution because it would be based in scarcity, and then we would lose the Cold War. So all of those global concerns were animating people's support for birth control. In addition, there was the thought that the reason that women entered the workforce was because if you can't scale the number of children you have to one paternal income, women will have to go into the workforce to feed their kids. And so the assumption was that birth control would enable kind of the Cleaver family model, as it were, right? Leave It to Beaver has one older brother. There are just the two kids, and June Cleaver can stay home and take care of the house. And that was the hope. That was very much the hope. And what I also found was that those people, the men having those conversations, were really instrumental. They sometimes partnered with more feminist organizations, but they were the people who were instrumental in terms of getting birth control into the medical mainstream and getting really serious political support for it, both in terms of sort of local level, what can you get in your clinics, your public hospitals, not just your women's health clinics,
Right.
and also sort of how is the federal government, why is it that JFK, the first and only one of two Catholic presidents, spoke about birth control as an important part of American foreign policy? And it wasn't in the end feminist activism. And that was really hard because I wanted it to be feminist activism.
Right. So basically you're saying instead of this being a kind of narrative about birth control as a force of liberation for women, it was really about birth control in service of pretty conservative notions of what a white middle class family should look like. And many people who were invested in upholding that model kind of using birth control not as something to liberate women, but really to like keep her within the confines of a particular family structure, which then is applied more broadly in terms of a vision of bringing that model to the developing world.
Right. And even more so, the backlash that we are now living in, but that really was, even though, like now I think, how naive was I when I thought that this was uncontroversial? I am some, like, the reason that those protests at the Women's Health Clinic in Atlanta seemed ineffectual is because I went to college and did clinic escorting during Operation Rescue,
Right,
right?
me
Like,
too.
why did I think this? But
Well, once by the time I also did clinic escorting in college, and that was a time when things were being blown up. And then it seemed like there was a little lull for a little while after that.
right, one of the things that I wrote about in the part of the preface that I didn't read is that when I was in high school, I played in a youth orchestra. And my dad was one of the parents who set up snack at the youth orchestra. And he set up snack with the father of someone in the flute section, and her older sister was killed in a shooting at a Planned Parenthood where she was the receptionist. It was her first job out of college.
Mm.
And, that was something, but it seemed within 10 years, it seemed so much better. But part of what I found was that backlash that started in the 1970s and really built momentum in the 1980s and 90s happened because, I mean, happened in part because of abortion, but also happened because of the feminist uses that feminists made excellent use of contraception. And that was when when it became a tool for feminist liberation, is the moment at which there stopped being consensus that it was a social good.
Right. So, in other words, when it becomes something that's used not only by married women to have fewer children, but by unmarried women and even, God forbid, teenagers. Um,
Or by
and
married women who want to have careers,
mhm,
right? As perhaps many people here know, your mom was one of the most prominent scholars of American Jewish history of her generation. Um, you know, that also perhaps was not what they had in mind. My mom has a had a long career as a biomedical editor, not unrelatedly only has two kids.
right, right. Um, so you mentioned in passing eugenics, which is a really important piece of this story in terms of how the kind of machinations of figuring out what are the arguments that we use for birth control, because obviously from our perspective now, eugenics is racist and horrible, but was, we know as historians, a very mainstream, sometimes even progressive minded, accepted view in the early 20th century. Um, and you write about how even after World War II, when there was an awareness that, like, we do not want to be embracing policies that now seem like Nazi policies around which races might be preferable to others, it kind of morphed from something that was less explicitly racist to a kind of softer version that was um, more focused on kind of health. Can you kind of talk about the evolution of eugenics and its role in birth control debates and policy?
Absolutely. So, in the early part of the 20th century, so first of all, in the late 19th and early 20th century, eugenics was understood as science. People believed, I almost said something else that is more politically charged than I mean it to be, but people believed in eugenics in the way that I believe in vaccines. Now, my concern, of course, is automatically that this comparison will undermine people's belief in vaccines, but please get your flu shots. But it was scientific best practice. If you were to go to the doctor would recommend all sorts of things that were rooted in eugenic science. And many of those things are things that we now think of as unmitigated social goods. Prenatal care, prenatal nutrition, early intervention pediatric care, pediatric nutrition. Eugenic activism is the kind of thing that brought us WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, which provides food stamps, breast pumps, medical care to low income households with little kids. Um, PE in schools was part of eugenics. General physical fitness, literacy programs. All of these things were part of an understanding of eugenics in which your goal was to create healthier children and child spacing was part of eugenics. Healthier babies with an idea that healthier babies would create healthier people, would create a healthier society. So lots of things that in the early 20th century came under the broader like rubric of eugenics were are things that we today accept as social goods. Some other things that we maybe debate a little bit more were also part of eugenics. So today we have genetic testing and genetic testing can be used for all sorts of things, right? Um, some of the most sort of obvious and widely accepted forms of genetic testing are, for instance, testing for Tay-Sachs. But if you are having IVF, you can select gender, for instance. Um, and they didn't have genetic testing at this time, but they did have this idea that if you had family histories of things that appeared to be genetic, you might consider not having children or having fewer children. And it's important to remember that it was also a different era in terms of medical treatment. So in there we I don't know if we'll talk about the amazing Catholic sources that I found, but read a survey in which a Catholic woman was writing in about her desire for birth control, and all five of her children had been born with cleft palates. And, the medical treatment that was available in the 1960s was really hard and really gruesome. And she talked about watching her children suffer. And, she talked about the expense of treating them and just worry. Um, so these are things that we as a society debate more, that they were debated then too. Now another difference between now and then is some moral behavioral things were also potentially understood to be genetic. So, if your mother was having kids outside of wedlock, you were maybe genetically predisposed to also make what people considered to be poor choices. And so again, it was murkier. And certainly today, disability rights activists object to, for instance, genetic testing for Down syndrome. And certainly the Catholic Church objects. And, you know, and not only that, but there were some pretty racist ideas in the past about kind of what sorts of behaviors might turn out to be genetic and things like that. So, in the early 20th century, all of the things that I described were part of eugenics. Also, sometimes better and healthier babies meant whiter babies, or waspier babies. There were times when people of color were the target of eugenics campaigns. There were times people argue when Catholics and Jews were part of eugenic campaigns. I think Melissa Clapper's work is really useful here. Again, this is a book that I cannot recommend enough. It is phenomenal. And what she shows is the interest in Jewish communities themselves in birth control. So I think her work pushes against that argument a little bit, and I think very convincingly and compellingly. But and sometimes it was just flat out racism. Like there was a lot of racism in the early 20th century, just like there is a lot of racism now. And some of the eugenics was really, really racist in this country. That tended to mean Black people, indigenous people. There were forced sterilizations on reservations up through the 1970s. I had a student at one point decline to take one of my classes because she thought it would be too hard because her aunts had been forcibly sterilized.
Mhm.
And that was recently enough that it makes me wonder whether the things that I've read that suggest that forced sterilization ended on reservations are overly optimistic. I don't know. But, you know, that's what, and as we all know, in Germany, it meant Jews, it meant disabled people, it meant the Roma. Um, and that changed what conversations about eugenics could look like in the United States. Um, there continued to be eugenic campaigns against African American people long after World War II, again, on reservations, long after World War II. But conversations started really thinking, moving away, with the exception of the communities that I just flagged, um, where people were often forcibly sterilized or sterilized without their knowledge, without their consent, into persuasive or coercive, but not legally sanctioned. So you see people trying to talk up. There's this Disney short film that I write about in the book that goes out to the developing world that is basically saying, like, if you have fewer kids, you can have a radio.
Mhm.
And so this is really not
Right.
productive. Um, if you have fewer kids, you can feed them and they will be happier and more comfortable. But, and I didn't write about this because of when I ended up kind of ending the project, when Norplant, which is a time release birth control capsule, was developed, there were attempts throughout the United States to tie people's access to welfare benefits to their use of Norplant. So if the state decided that you had had too many children for your age, for your income level, in order to get welfare, you would be and this did not happen in most places, but these were attempts, right, to legalize this. You would be given for free a Norplant, which lasts for 5 years, and it wouldn't be free to have it removed. So the removal cost in those dollars, the estimates that were being floated around, the Religion News Service was reporting this, and um, it's available in both the American Jewish Historical Society archives and in the Presbyterian Historical Society archives. Um, $300 to $500. And we're talking about sort of mid 90s money.
Hmm. Right. Um, the eugenic tarring brush, if we can call it that, has definitely been applied to Margaret Sanger in recent
Mhm.
years. There's been a lot of sort of almost like cancellation of Margaret Sanger because of her association with you, with eugenics. And I really appreciated your kind of sensitive assessment of her and her legacy. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see her in this issue?
Sure. And I just wrote, if anyone is like curious about seeing more of this but doesn't want to read the entire book, I have a short piece coming out that talks a lot about Margaret Sanger in Sources, a Journal of Jewish Ideas, which is from the Shalom Hartman Institute. Um, so Margaret Sanger was a trained nurse and a well-educated person who was alive in the first part of the 20th century. So in that sense, she was she a eugenicist? Yes, she was. As many of her conversation partners would be. That's simply true. And again, remember all of those other things that are were also part of eugenics. Margaret Sanger believed passionately in women's ability to control their own bodies. And there's no real smoking gun that suggests that Margaret Sanger supported race-based eugenics. Margaret Sanger was also a white person alive in the early 20th century. I am not saying that she was free from racist ideas. Um, I don't think very many of us, even in what we would consider to be a more enlightened time now, are really free from racist ideas. That's part of what it is to grow up in a society that is rooted in institutional racism. She certainly expressed racist ideas. She was also someone who was very, very self-confident, and I think was inclined probably to think that she knew better than other people what would be good for them. And I have to say, I think if Margaret Sanger had had access to genetic testing, disability rights activists probably wouldn't have liked her very much. Although she was also working in a society that had no support for disabled people at all, what she would think in a world with the ADA might also be different, right? In all fairness to her. But remember what I said, I think a really key piece is the piece that I said about Margaret Sanger's self-confidence. Margaret Sanger was willing to collaborate with eugenicists who were much more awful from the standpoint of racism. Birth control activists did not have a lot of respectability or cachet. Part of what I am describing is a process through which birth control activism became respectable by becoming less feminist.
Hmm.
Margaret Sanger wanted the cachet of that respectability. The eugenicists were men of science, and she was like sort of this like radical nurse. And they did not necessarily want much to do with her because they didn't want to be tarnished by the like radical feminism. And in order to get the resources and cachet of that movement to get birth control into the hands of more women, Margaret Sanger was willing to get into bed, as it were, with people like Clarence Gamble, who was a eugenicist. I think she often thought she could outflank them and often turned out to be wrong. I think that's like, and so it's complicated, right? She's a morally gray figure in lots of ways. She, I think, would not have supported state-based eugenics. She did believe that people who were morally lax or likely to have mental or physical disabilities in their family should probably use birth control more than other people. But she was also living in a society that didn't have a solution for those people that wasn't warehousing them in institutions. She set up birth control clinics in predominantly Black neighborhoods. She was passionate about getting birth control into the hands of the poor. People of color had less access to birth control because they were statistically more likely to be poor. I don't think she was someone who was interested in fewer Black babies just for purely racist reasons.
Right.
But, you know, she also absolutely, completely, and totally had some complicated attitudes about race. That her colleagues, her Black colleagues, tended to be people who were deeply invested in politics of respectability, which suggests that some forms of Black culture are better than others, right?
Right.
And is also a way of being that has received a lot of critique. But you know,
I-
there's a moment when Martin Luther King receives and accepts the Margaret Sanger Award, which
Mhm.
is a Planned Parenthood award for basically human rights. And he
Yeah.
says wonderful and complimentary things about her willingness to go to jail to give people, including Black people, self-determination and a tool that they could use to lift themselves out of poverty.
Yeah. I mean, and her first clinic is famously in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn in 1916. And yeah, I always saw her as very pragmatic, like as you're
Mhm.
saying, willing to get into bed with anyone who she thought could for further her mission. And her mission was feminist at root. Though yes, as you're saying, potentially complicated in many other ways.
I think the other thing I would say, so several years ago, the New York Planned Parenthood was called the Sanger. It
Hmm.
was the Sanger Clinic. It was called the Sanger. It shows up in Mary McCarthy's group as no, I'm sorry. It's in Goodbye
Goodbye,
Columbus. It's in
Columbus.
Philip
Yeah.
Roth. In it, there's just I think there's an unnamed clinic in Mary McCarthy, but in it's in Goodbye Columbus. Philip Roth refers to the Sanger. Um, and they took her name off of that building. Now,
Hmm.
as a historian, I think we need to not cancel Margaret Sanger, but rather understand that people are products of their time and they are complicated. As somebody who cares passionately about access to reproductive health care for anyone who might need it, and who is aware of the reputation that Margaret Sanger has, not totally deservedly, but also not totally undeservedly in communities of color, I think Planned Parenthood was absolutely right to do that. I think the project of a historian and the project of somebody trying to lower barriers to access are fundamentally different projects.
Yeah. So let's talk about Jews. Obviously your book is talking about religion broadly, and there's lots of great stuff, as you said, about Catholic debates and about liberal Protestants. But let's talk a little bit about Jews. What were some of the ways that Jews framed the issue of birth control? I mean, again, here we're often talking about Jewish leaders. So in this case, in this period, that is rabbis who are at this time men. Um, but so what are some of the frameworks and what was at stake for them?
So I think a lot of what was at stake for these rabbis, by and large, but also for the kind of women that end up. Melissa Clapper writes wonderfully about Florence Rose, who is Margaret Sanger's personal assistant, and moves from being a secretary to being really a collaborator and thought partner in all sorts of important ways. But part of what's going on for Jews is that they are working out what it means to be part of sort of a newly accepted American religion. World War II really changes the way that Catholics and Jews are seen in American society. Um, there's a very famous book by a sociologist named Will Herberg called Protestant Catholic Jew that argues that these three religions are the three American religions. And this is and we start talking about a tri-faith America, or a Judeo-Christian America. And today, we do not like the term Judeo-Christian. We think of it as both sort of erasing very real differences between Jews and Christians, and also erasing very real differences. Like there isn't one Judaism and there isn't one Christianity, right? But at the time it was a term of immense promise. It meant that Jews and Catholics were going to get to be players on the American sort of political and sort of public square in a way that they hadn't before. And so birth control becomes one of the places where that's getting navigated. Um, Catholics are a much bigger religious minority. For by this time, there are more Catholics in the United States than there are any given kind of Protestant. So there are more Protestants than there are Catholics, but there are more Catholics than there are Episcopalians or Presbyterians or Methodists.
Hmm.
And well, we might or might not care very much about the difference between a Presbyterian and a Methodist. They did.
They do, yeah.
They do. Especially at that time, right? So Jews are a much smaller group. Now, where birth control is concerned, I joked at one point that the thesis of this book could be you can get Protestants to support anything if Catholics oppose it, right? Like Catholics were the absolute bête noire of this conversation. Um, and so it was a convenient position for Jews to be in. They could be allies with Protestants, which put them in kind of a power seat. But there were compromises inherent in that. And there were also concerns. Part of the way that Jews could be seen as good partners with Protestants in this Judeo-Christian model was by playing down some of their differences. And at first, that feels really important. But within about 10 to 15 years, people start getting really nervous about the implications of playing down those differences. And I can kind of tell a couple of specific stories if that would be helpful.
Hmm. Yeah, sure.
So, Planned Parenthood sets up their first National Clergymen's Committee in the early 1940s. They were kind of starting to have conversations and they got derailed by Pearl Harbor. But before the end of World War II, Planned Parenthood has a National Clergymen's Committee. They are basically trying to mobilize against Catholics who are trying to block availability of birth control in American cities. And this is a big deal because American cities are heavily Catholic often, right?
Hmm.
There's an entire battle and part of about contraception in New York City's public hospitals. And part of the problem is that 48% of the tax base is Catholic. So one of the members of the executive committee of the National Clergymen's Committee is a man named Rabbi Sidney Goldstein, and he's at the Free Synagogue. He's an associate rabbi at the Free Synagogue, which is today the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. The rabbi was Stephen Wise in this moment. And that's who he's working for and with. And he is a loud supporter of birth control. And but what he's got a different approach than his Protestant colleagues. His Protestant colleagues are basically arguing for all of the reasons that birth control is moral. It's good for kids to be raised by their mother. Christians should be prayerfully bringing the number of children into their family that they can responsibly care for and raise in good, loving Christian homes, shifting notions of what child rearing should look like. Rabbi Goldstein knows that nobody is going to care what Judaism thinks is good or ethical or moral about um, child rearing or sex. He knows nobody is going to care what the Talmud says about how many times you're supposed to have sex with your wife based on your profession. Remember that. We're coming back to that one. Um, and so he makes arguments based in American law. He basically says Americans have the human right to the best available medical care. No one religion should be able to block other people from making their own moral decisions. So while his Protestant colleagues are making arguments about what the moral decision should be, he's essentially making arguments about religious freedom and medical rights. And so you
And
can see that kind
we
of minority positioning.
right. And we see that those arguments are still being made in very often in abortion debates right
Mhm.
now by Jews in terms of saying that like part of the issue with places that have made abortion illegal is that it is not allowing Jews in those places to exercise religious freedom to make their own choices by what is appropriate to their own religious practice.
Absolutely. And I've been honored to be one of the voices putting together an amicus brief for one of, in Indiana.
Yeah, yeah.
Using and it's an argument. He is in many ways one of the people who was the architect of one of the key arguments that we use today.
Right.
Um, so he's making that argument in the 1940s. That argument continues through the late 50s. By the late 60s, you can see some other positioning on Jews. So Alan Guttmacher, who was had varying roles throughout the course of my book, but was the medical director of Planned Parenthood in the moment that in the late 60s, when he wrote the article that I'm about to talk about, wrote an article for the journal magazine Judaism, in which he basically was talking about what the Talmud says about birth control. Now, earlier, kind of back in that National Clergymen's Committee day, a rabbi had worked with Planned Parenthood to put together a Jewish argument for birth control using the Talmud, also a little bit the Torah, um, and had basically said, just so you know, the Brooklyn Rabbinical Association is not going to endorse this position because while you can use the Talmud to argue for birth control, you can also use the Talmud to argue against birth control. So it's going to be a non-starter.
Our texts are
Um,
very sneaky that way.
yeah, right. Like, I mean, this is just sort of how religious texts work. But Guttmacher basically uses those arguments in favor of birth control for to in the Talmud to make a case. And it's like a 5-page article. But basically, two things are made clear in Jewish law and tradition. And the first is that sex in the context of marriage is understood as fundamental and good, contributing to shalom bayit. And he demonstrates that shalom bayit being peace in the home. And also that health is to be valued and protected. And so in a Jewish context, if a woman's health or a person with the capacity for pregnancy's health would be damaged by pregnancy, the answer can't be that a married couple stops having sex. The answer has to be something else, and the something else is birth control.
Mhm.
And so that's basically Guttmacher's argument in about 5 pages. A year later, a conservative rabbi, and I think it's important that he's a conservative rabbi in part because when he frames his argument as if it's a universal Jewish truth, which I feel like you can do a little bit better if you're coming from the conservative movement because you're coming from the middle of the road, right? Um, Basically makes the same argument, but in much more detail. Um, Such that when it gets reviewed in the Journal of the AMA, or is it the New England Journal of Medicine? I'm now not remembering. An extremely prestigious medical journal reviews the book. And they basically say this is a really good book for rabbis and doctors who are learned in Jewish law. For all other doctors, this is a useful thing to have in case you need to be looking something up for a patient. Um, but basically, he is saying the same things that Guttmacher is saying, but you can see that nervousness about Jewish positions vis-a-vis Christians in
Mhm.
the argument that he makes because he wants it to be really clear that Christians think it's better to marry than to burn, which is something that is in the Pauline letters. It's something that St. Paul says, which is basically to say you should control your lust. But if you can't control your lust, you should get married and have sex in the context of your marriage, right? But up until the Protestant Reformation, the highest form of Christian life was the celibate clergy and monks and nuns, right? The priesthood, monks, nuns. And he's like, that's never been the case in Judaism. And what he's essentially trying to say is that Judaism is a more hip and modern religion than Christianity, even in the context of, even in its most orthodox formations,
Right.
right? And so he's really sort of trying to say, even when we look old world and we're doing things that you think are weird, like even when we're not the reform movement, which he is sort of painting as, having capitulated to a Protestant mainstream. Remember, he's a conservative rabbi. He's saying, even when you think we're a little weird because we won't eat bacon cheeseburgers, we are fundamentally a truly modern and
Modern.
American
Yeah.
religion. And so that I think is an interesting piece of the Jewish story there.
So one place where there was also a kind of different Jewish perspective was around the population control argument for birth control, and the kind of idea of zero population growth as a goal, which was a really important argument for birth control in kind of the second half of the 20th century. But of course, Jews had a slightly different perspective on that coming out of the Holocaust and with a sense of like needing to replenish numbers. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of specific Jewish debate there?
Yeah, there are kind of two ways of thinking about this Jewish debate, and one is maybe more of an internal conversation, Quincy, and the other is more of an external conversation. Um, the external conversation is that one of the things that, again, Jews want to look modern, they want to look American, they want to look like they are sort of part of this Judeo-Christian team. So if everybody is really, really, really worried about population, but because Jews are worried about replenishing numbers post-Holocaust, um, basically talking about the Holocaust is a way of saying to their Protestant sort of thought partners and political allies, we believe in this problem. We believe that the population is growing too quickly. We support attempts to get birth control out into the world. We support there's a letter in which like basically every religious group in the country except for the Catholic Church writes to Richard Nixon to ask him to include birth control in American foreign policy. Jewish organizations sign off on that. But we are a very, very small group. If we apply this to ourselves, it won't even be a drop in the bucket. So we can agree with the scientific reality of this, but should not be held to the same do not have more than two or three kids standards,
Hmm.
right? That is sort of a Jewish argument to their Protestant political allies. Internally, there's a lot of sort of talking about the Holocaust as a reason to have more children. But there's an uglier side of that conversation and an anti-feminist side. In 1978, a woman named Shirley Frank writes a piece for Lilith, the Jewish feminist magazine, um, and basically says, look, nobody was worried. Yes, we have lost a lot of people. And let's be super clear, the Holocaust is really being mobilized in these conversations. Somebody, a rabbi says in the New York Times, we lost 6 million people in the Holocaust. If Jews had not been using birth control for the time in between the Holocaust and now, we would have 6 million more people, right? It's a direct comparison using those numbers. And Shirley Frank basically says, because the global population is growing, there are actually more Jews alive today than there have been at many other moments in Jewish history. We shouldn't be as worried about our numbers as we are. And also, nobody was talking about the Holocaust as a reason to have more children in the way that they are now until feminism. And it's kind of true. There's a conference at one point, like a conference of sociologists that gets written up and published in which people are talking about it's 1976 and they are hoping that the economic crisis will mean that the Jewish women are going to college at higher rates than ever before and Jews tend to If 30% of Americans have college degrees, 50% of Jews do. Zero population growth is very popular on college campuses. More Jews are in college than the average American population. And they're sort of saying, like, maybe women, it won't make economic sense for women to go to college or grad school anymore. And so they'll stay home and start families sooner. People are saying, women are still saying they want 3 to 4 kids, but they're going to college and they're going to grad school. And if you say, I want 4 kids and you start having kids at 20, you are more likely to achieve having 4 kids than if you say, I want 4 kids and you start having 4 kids at 30, right? Also, if you are staying home and raising kids, you might decide that you can have 4 kids, but if you're trying to have if you have 2 kids, go back to work as a lawyer, you might decide you just can't juggle more, right? You might quit sooner. They're worried about all of these things. They're also worried because if generations are 20 years apart, you get more people faster than if generations are 30 years apart, right?
Right.
And you can see these and you can see explicit hope that women will stop being in the workforce, will stop being in grad school, will stay home, will have babies, and will donate their unpaid labor to the sisterhood, to all sorts of things that had been making the Judaism of the 1950s and 60s run,
Right.
right? And
So
so,
it's a
but it's
backlashy kind of approach.
it is, but it's framed not in sort of the, oh my God, the death of the American family conversation that you hear from the religious right, but in a really nervous, in this language of the Holocaust and in this question of Jewish continuity and Jewish survival that puts the responsibility for the communal survival of Jews on the reproductive capacity of Jewish women.
Right.
And so
Uh,
there's never like a push against birth control, like you shouldn't use it at all, but there is an extremely pronatalist conversation that kind of suggests that birth control is there to make sure that those babies are well spaced and healthy, and that once you've had your 4 or your 6, you can stop.
right. There's a place in the book I remember where you talk about how there's this kind of dissonance that Jewish women continue to use birth control, Jewish doctors continue to prescribe it, Jewish leaders continue to support it, but at the same time are kind of sending this other message about really we need to be focusing on larger families, Jewish continuity, and that being a primarily women's responsibility to uphold for the community.
And I have to say, it's really tempting to say this is something that is coming from men. But Blue Greenberg, for instance, who is, the mother of Jewish Orthodox feminism, her conversation does say, you know, perhaps mothers and fathers could pause their careers or kind of scale back their careers in order to make this possible. But it is coming from Jewish feminists as well. And I think, the Holocaust um, piece of the conversation is very, very compelling and very, very painful for people. And particularly in that generation where the people who are sort of reproductive age, right? The people in their 20s and 30s are the first generation born after the Holocaust. And for the generation older, I think it's very easy for them to start to see a declension narrative of these young people today don't remember they were born after, they don't know what it was like before. And I don't want to, on the one hand, I think it's a very backlashy and in many ways anti-feminist conversation. But I think that part of the reason that it comes from people who in other times and places have really good feminist credentials is because it's so painful.
Sure. And it's complex. I mean, and that's part of what you write about is just sort of the complexity of all of these factors. And in fact, I'm sad that we're out of time because there's so much more to talk about. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that you write about at the end of the book of sort of like how did we end up move from this liberal religious movement supporting birth control and end up with the religious right having won so many battles is that liberal religious movements actually lived in a place of complexity and were trying to hold these really nuanced arguments that were harder to
They soundbite
capture.
really
They didn't,
badly.
right, they didn't work in sound bites. They're also harder for people. They're more complex for people to hold, and humans kind of gravitate towards things that are a little more binary or black and white, and the right really knew how to leverage that and capitalize on that, and the left sort of fell victim to its own desire to hold the complexity. And I think we see that playing out in so many ways now, which is really hard to see.
Really hard because I think that the complexity and the nuance is essential to
Absolutely.
our ability to hold together a diverse society.
Yeah,
Um, but it's also really hard to mobilize around.
sure. Well, there is so much more to talk about, but thank you so much, Samira, for this really rich conversation. And thank you to all of you for being with us tonight. As I always say, there's more to discover at JWA. We're going to put some links in the chat for you of some other things to read in our encyclopedia. There is so much, but I picked out a few things. There are two articles about Jewish women and birth control in the US, as well as an article about Jewish sources on contraception. We have material on so many Jewish women who were birth control activists, like Fania Mindell, who helped open the first birth control clinic in the US with Margaret Sanger in 1916, Bessie Louise Moses, who founded the first birth control clinic in Baltimore in 1927, Hannah Meyer Stone, who was a physician who worked with Sanger, and too many more to name. You can listen to the podcast interview that I referenced with Samira on her book, The Racism of People Who Love You. And if you like podcasts, you might also be interested in our episode about our bodies ourselves. Um, Please join us next week for a conversation with Allegra Goodman about her new book, This Is Not About Us. And until next time, happy Juneteenth, everybody. Please take care and let's take care of each other. Good night, everyone. And thank you again, Samira.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you to everyone else at JWA as well.